Before we dive in, let me know in the comments, have you ever seen someone get what they deserve right away? Maybe someone was rude, and just a few minutes later, something bad happened to them. Or maybe you saw kindness win in the end. Tell me your story below. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button if you love stories like this. Now, let's get into today's story. This happened on a regular flight, just like any other. The plane was big and full of passengers, all getting ready for their trip. Some people were excited, looking forward to their destination. Others were tired, just hoping for a quiet flight. The sound of rolling suitcases, beeping seatbelt signs, and the steady voice of the pilot filled the air. The engines roared, and the plane slowly started to move. The crew walked up and down the aisles, checking on things. Among them was a flight attendant named Lisa. She was tall, dressed neatly in her uniform, and always looked serious. But Lisa had a reputation. She was strict. She didn't smile much. She followed the rules exactly, and if a passenger asked for something extra, she often said no. Lisa wasn't known for being kind. In fact, many passengers who had flown with her before remembered her as cold. Some flight attendants made passengers feel comfortable and welcome. Lisa? Not so much. She believed that her job was to follow the rules and nothing more. If someone needed help, they had to wait until it was the right time. And today, one passenger was about to find out just how strict Lisa could be. Near the back of the plane, in a small window seat, sat an elderly woman named Margaret. Margaret was in her late 70s, with soft grey hair and gentle eyes. She wore a simple sweater and a long skirt, the kind of outfit that older women often wore when traveling. Her hands, wrinkled with age, rested on her lap, and she held a small purse close to her side. She sat quietly, looking out the window, watching as the airport became smaller and smaller below them. For Margaret, this flight was special. It was the first time she had traveled alone in years. Her late husband used to sit next to her on flights, holding her hand when the plane took off. But now, she was on her own. This was a big step for her, and she was a little nervous. But she told herself she would be okay. After all, flights had friendly staff to help passengers, right? At least, that's what she thought. As the plane reached cruising altitude, Margaret started to feel a little weak. She had been sitting in the airport for hours before the flight, and she hadn't had much to drink. Her throat felt dry. Her head was feeling light, almost dizzy. She knew she needed water. Margaret looked up and saw a small button above her seat. It had a picture of a flight attendant on it. She had seen people press it before when they needed help. Maybe she should press it too. At first, she hesitated. She didn't like to bother people. She was the kind of woman who always said please and thank you and never wanted to be a problem. But this time, she really needed something. She slowly lifted her hand and pressed the button. A soft ding sound filled the air, and a small light turned on above her seat. Margaret waited patiently, her hands folded neatly on her lap. She didn't want to seem impatient, so she kept a polite smile on her face. She was sure someone would come soon. A few rows ahead, Lisa heard the sound. She sighed. Another passenger needing something already? The drink service hadn't even started yet. Lisa glanced at the seat number and walked toward Margaret. She didn't smile. She didn't ask if she was okay. She simply stood there, looking down at the old woman. Yes, Lisa said, her voice flat. Margaret looked up and gave her a warm smile. Excuse me, dear. Could I have a little water, please? I'm feeling a bit dizzy. Lisa's expression didn't change. The drink service will begin soon, she said coldly. You'll have to wait. Margaret's smile faded just a little. Oh. I see, she said, her voice soft. I feel a little unwell. If it's not too much trouble. Lisa sighed loudly, rolling her eyes. She didn't like it when passengers asked for things before she was ready to give them. It was against the rules, and Lisa loved the rules. "Ma'am," she said, crossing her arms, "we have a schedule. Water will be served soon. Please be patient." Margaret nodded politely, though her cheeks turned pink with embarrassment. Lisa turned and walked away without another word. The passengers around Margaret had noticed. Some looked shocked. A younger woman sitting across the aisle frowned. "She looks sick," she whispered to the man next to her. "Couldn't she have just brought her some water?" The man shook his head. "Some people have no kindness," he muttered. Margaret tried to act like she wasn't upset. She folded her hands in her lap again, taking slow breaths. It was fine. She could wait. But 5 minutes later, something happened that no one saw coming. And Lisa was about to regret everything. The flight had been in the air for about an hour now. Most passengers were relaxed, reading, sleeping, or watching movies. The soft hum of the engines filled the cabin, and the flight seemed peaceful. But not for Margaret. She still felt weak. Her throat was dry, and her head felt light, almost as if she were floating. She had never felt this dizzy before on a plane. She took a deep breath and tried to stay calm, but the feeling only got worse. Margaret knew she needed water. She wasn't the kind of person to ask for things unless it was really important. But right now, her body was telling her that this was important. She reached up and pressed the call button again. A soft ding rang through the cabin, signaling that a passenger needed assistance. Lisa, the flight attendant, was already annoyed when she heard the sound. She sighed loudly, not even trying to hide her frustration. It was the same seat number as before. That old lady again. Lisa walked slowly toward the back of the plane. She didn't rush. In her mind, Margaret could wait. Finally, she reached Margaret's seat and stood there with no smile on her face. "Yes?" Lisa asked, her voice flat and uninterested. Margaret looked up at her, her face pale. "Excuse me, miss," she said softly. "Could I please have some water?" Lisa rolled her eyes. She sighed dramatically, as if Margaret had just asked for something ridiculous. "We'll be serving drinks soon," Lisa muttered, tapping her foot impatiently. Margaret hesitated. Her hands felt cold. Her head felt heavier. I feel a little dizzy," she whispered. Lisa's expression changed. But not in a kind way. Her eyes hardened, and she crossed her arms. "We have policies, ma'am," she said, her voice sharp. "You'll have to wait." Margaret blinked. She wasn't asking for much. Just a small cup of water. She nodded slowly. "All right," she whispered, her voice almost too soft to hear. Nearby passengers had noticed the conversation. A young woman sitting across the aisle frowned. The woman leaned closer to her seatmate, a man in his 30s, and whispered, "She looks unwell. Can't the flight attendant just bring her some water?" The man shook his head. "Some people just don't care," he muttered. The young woman's frown deepened. She couldn't understand how someone could be so uncaring toward an elderly woman. She turned back toward Lisa and spoke up. "Excuse me," she said firmly. "She's not feeling well. Can't you just—" Lisa didn't let her finish. She cut her off, her voice sharp. "I said no." Her tone was final. Then, without another word, Lisa turned on her heel and walked away. Margaret sighed, resting her head against the seat. Her fingers trembled slightly as she placed them in her lap. Her body was telling her that she needed water now. But Lisa was gone. Margaret closed her eyes. She didn't know that within minutes, everything was about to change. Passengers start to take notice. A few minutes passed. Margaret sat still, hoping the dizziness would go away. But it didn't. If anything, it got worse. Her head started to feel even lighter, and the sounds around her felt distant. The young woman across the aisle kept glancing at Margaret. Something wasn't right. The woman nudged her seatmate. "Look at her," she whispered. "She doesn't look good." The man turned his head, studying Margaret's pale face. He agreed. "She needs water," he said quietly. "Now." The young woman bit her lip. She couldn't stay silent anymore. She reached up and pressed the call button herself. Ding! Lisa, who had just finished arranging snack trays, heard the sound again. She groaned. "What now?" she muttered under her breath. She walked back to the same section of the plane and saw the young woman looking directly at her. Lisa put on her fake polite expression. "Yes?" she asked, forcing a small smile. The young woman didn't smile back. "The lady next to me is not feeling well," she said firmly. "She needs water." Lisa's fake smile disappeared. Her eyes narrowed. "I already told her." "I don't care what you told her," the young woman snapped. "She needs water now." Lisa's face hardened. But before she could argue, another voice spoke up. "She really does look sick," said an older man a few rows ahead. A mother holding a baby turned her head. "She's been pale for a while now," she added. "Maybe she's dehydrated." A teenager sitting 2 rows back nodded. "She hasn't even moved for the last few minutes." Lisa's chest tightened. Now, too many passengers were paying attention. She knew she couldn't ignore them all. Still, she didn't like being challenged. With an annoyed sigh, Lisa stormed off toward the galley. She poured half a cup of water, barely filling it. Then she marched back to Margaret's seat and thrust the cup toward her. "Here," she muttered. Margaret took the cup gratefully. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice still weak. Lisa didn't reply. She simply turned and walked away again. But what Lisa didn't know was that someone else had noticed. And that person had the power to change everything. The turning point. A few rows up, sitting quietly, was a man in a navy blue suit. He had been watching the entire scene. And he wasn't just another passenger. He was the airline's regional manager, Lisa's boss. He had booked this flight secretly, without telling the crew. He liked to see how his employees treated passengers when they didn't know he was watching. And what he had just seen shocked him. His eyes narrowed as he thought back to everything Lisa had done. Her eye rolls. Her sharp words. Her complete lack of kindness. He had seen enough. Slowly, he stood up. And as he started walking toward the back of the plane, Lisa was about to get the biggest surprise of her life. The plane was quiet once again. The hum of the engines filled the cabin, and most of the passengers had returned to their quiet routines. Some were watching movies, others reading books, and a few simply staring out of the window at the clouds. But there was an undeniable tension in the air. The scene with Lisa and Margaret had left a lingering feeling among the passengers. Many had seen what had happened, and whispers started to spread. The young woman, who had first spoken up for Margaret, turned to her seatmate and whispered, "Did you see that? She was so rude." The man beside her just nodded, but his expression was clearly one of confusion. He didn't understand why the flight attendant had been so harsh with the elderly woman. Some of the other passengers, seated just a few rows away from Margaret, started to talk in hushed voices as well. The baby's mother, who had also noticed the situation, turned to the teenage boy behind her and said, "That poor lady looks like she's really sick. Why didn't she help her sooner?" The teenager just shrugged, still a little too shocked to say anything more. Despite the murmurs and soft conversations around the plane, Lisa continued on like nothing happened. She wasn't fazed by the whispers. After all, she had done her duty. She had given Margaret a small cup of water, and that should have been enough, in her mind. She had more important things to do. The rest of the passengers could complain all they wanted. She had a job to do. Lisa marched down the aisle, checking on the other passengers. She made sure that everyone had their snacks and drinks, but she barely even glanced back at Margaret's seat. It was like she had already forgotten about the entire situation. She wasn't thinking about the elderly woman's condition anymore. She was too busy going through the motions, handling the rest of her responsibilities. But Margaret still didn't feel well. She had sipped the water slowly, hoping it would help. But the dizziness didn't go away. It was getting worse. The world around her felt even further away. She could hear voices, but they sounded so distant. She felt like she might fall asleep, but at the same time, she was too scared to close her eyes. Something was wrong. Margaret's hand gripped the armrest of her seat as she tried to stay awake. Her head was spinning. She needed help, and she needed it soon. Meanwhile, the whispers continued to grow among the passengers. The tension in the cabin was clear. No one was speaking openly, but people were clearly concerned. They didn't like what they had seen. They didn't like the way Lisa treated Margaret. And they didn't like the way she acted like it didn't matter. Just when things seemed to be settling down, a new voice cut through the silence. A man dressed in a sharp navy suit stood up from his seat in first class. His movements were calm and deliberate, like he was used to being in control. He didn't rush or seem hurried in any way. But there was something unmistakable about the way he walked. His presence was almost commanding. He wasn't like the other passengers, who were just sitting back in their seats. No, this man was important. The man moved smoothly down the aisle, his eyes scanning the faces of the passengers as he made his way to the back of the plane. He had been watching everything from the moment the incident started. He had seen the way Lisa dismissed Margaret's request for water. He had seen the way Margaret's health seemed to decline, and how Lisa didn't even seem to care. But most of all, he had seen the disrespect in Lisa's actions, the way she acted like it was just another day at work, no big deal. And that didn't sit well with him. As he reached Margaret's seat, he gently kneeled beside her. His voice was soft and caring, but there was a tone of authority that couldn't be ignored. "Ma'am, are you okay?" he asked, his eyes filled with genuine concern. Margaret, her head still spinning, looked up at the man. She could barely make out his face, but she felt a small sense of relief. Someone cared. Someone had noticed. "Ma'am," the man asked again, his voice a little softer now. Margaret took a shallow breath and tried to speak, but her words came out in a whisper. "I don't feel good," she said. Her voice was weak, barely audible. "I feel so dizzy, and I think I need more water." The man's face hardened, but not in an angry way. It was more like he was gathering his thoughts, figuring out what to do next. His expression was focused, determined. Before Margaret could say anything else, he turned his gaze to the front of the plane. Lisa was standing there, going through the usual routine of walking up and down the aisles, checking on passengers. She had no idea what was happening at the back of the plane. But the man did. He stood up, and in one smooth motion, he walked toward Lisa. His every step was measured, purposeful, and as he approached her, he didn't speak immediately. He simply waited until she noticed him. Lisa saw the man coming closer and rolled her eyes, thinking he was just another passenger with a complaint. She was already annoyed by everything going on and didn't have time for another person to make a fuss. "Sir, passengers are not allowed to," Lisa started, but then she saw his name tag. It wasn't just a name tag. It was a manager's badge. Her eyes widened as she recognized the name. It was the regional manager. Her boss. Lisa froze for a moment, her mouth opening and closing as she tried to find words. But none came. She felt her heart race. This wasn't just any passenger. This wasn't just someone she could brush off. This was someone who had the power to change everything. Lisa felt a cold chill run down her spine. She could already feel the weight of her mistake settling in. Her boss, the regional manager, didn't speak right away. He just looked at her, his gaze unwavering. Lisa opened her mouth, but words didn't come out. Instead, he broke the silence. "Are you aware of what just happened, Lisa?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. Lisa didn't know how to answer. She had been so sure of herself before, so confident that she was right. But now, with her boss standing there, her confidence was shattered. The passengers around them had fallen silent, watching everything unfold. They had seen enough to know that something important was happening now. They had witnessed how Lisa treated the elderly woman. They had seen how rude and dismissive she had been. They were now waiting to see what would happen next. Would Lisa be held accountable? Would she get away with it? The tension in the cabin grew thicker as the manager stood there, waiting for Lisa to respond. Lisa's mind raced, but the words that came out of her mouth were almost too quiet to hear. I didn't think it was a big deal," she mumbled. "I was just doing my job." The manager didn't respond immediately. He took a step closer to Lisa, and when he spoke, his words were direct. "You're not just doing your job. You're responsible for the well-being of the passengers. And when you dismiss someone like that, when you treat them with disrespect, it's not okay." Lisa's face turned red, but she didn't argue. She knew she was in trouble. And then, the unexpected happened. The manager turned back toward Margaret, who was still sitting there, looking pale and weak. He knelt beside her again, his expression softening. "Ma'am, I'm so sorry for the way you've been treated," he said gently. "You'll be fine now. We're going to make sure you get the help you need." The passengers, watching everything unfold, began to murmur among themselves. They had just seen a flight attendant's mistake, but more than that, they were watching something important happen. They were watching justice. And for Margaret, it wasn't just about getting the water she needed anymore. It was about something bigger. Something that could change everything for her and for everyone else on that plane. The manager turned back to Lisa. "I need to speak with you in private," he said. And Lisa, knowing she had no choice, nodded silently. The manager stood still for a moment, watching Lisa as if weighing her every action, while Margaret's condition seemed to worsen by the second. Lisa had no choice but to stand there and face the consequences of her decision. But she knew that she couldn't back down now. She had to act professional, right? That's what she had been trained to do. But her training hadn't prepared her for this. As the manager turned back toward Margaret, the elderly woman barely registered what was happening around her. Her head was clouded, and her vision blurred, but there was something reassuring in the man's voice, something that made her believe that maybe just maybe someone cared about her well-being. The way he spoke, the calm yet firm tone in his voice, made Margaret feel like everything was going to be okay. "You don't have to worry, ma'am," the manager continued, keeping his voice soft and gentle. "We'll make sure you get proper attention. Don't worry." Margaret smiled faintly, relieved by the kindness in his voice. But her struggle wasn't over yet. She still needed water, she still felt faint, and she still wasn't sure if she could make it through the rest of the flight. The world around her felt like it was slipping away, and she felt weak. As the manager turned his attention to Lisa, Margaret closed her eyes for a moment, her breathing becoming shallow. In her mind, she couldn't help but think, why had Lisa ignored her? All she had asked for was a simple glass of water, and instead, she had been dismissed. It wasn't like she was asking for anything special, just a little bit of help. Margaret couldn't understand why she was treated so harshly. The manager now turned to Lisa with a calm but stern gaze. He had seen everything, heard everything. He wasn't happy with what had happened. And he didn't waste any time. "You know, Lisa," he said slowly, his voice unwavering, "your job is to help passengers, not to ignore them when they ask for something as simple as a glass of water. You need to be better than this. Not just as a flight attendant, but as a human being." Lisa stood there, her face red from the intensity of the manager's words. She had tried to keep her cool, but now she was on the defensive. What was happening to her? She had always prided herself on being efficient, on doing things her way. She hadn't been a troublemaker, she'd always been by the book. But now, she was facing something much bigger than she ever expected. I didn't think it was that serious, Lisa stammered, trying to defend herself. The manager's eyes narrowed. It doesn't matter what you think, Lisa. It matters how you make people feel. You work in customer service, and that means you have to treat everyone with respect, no matter how small the request. Lisa didn't know how to respond. All of a sudden, her confidence felt shaken. This was more than just a mistake, this was about her attitude, her professionalism. And she could feel the weight of that mistake bearing down on her. Around them, the passengers were silent. They had been watching the whole situation unfold, and some couldn't help but feel a sense of justice in the air. The manager wasn't letting Lisa off the hook. He wasn't going to just let her walk away from this. And that feeling, the feeling of something being set right, was growing stronger. It was like a wave of satisfaction washing over the cabin. Something was going to change. Meanwhile, the flight attendants who had witnessed the situation began to look uneasy. They had never seen the manager so serious before. He was known to be professional, yes, but today, it seemed different. The seriousness of the situation was evident to everyone, and it wasn't just about Margaret anymore. It was about everyone on the flight. Everyone who had witnessed what happened. It was a lesson, a clear message about how important kindness and respect were in a job like theirs. But while everyone was watching Lisa and the manager, Margaret's condition didn't get any better. Her dizziness only seemed to grow worse, and she was now having trouble keeping her eyes open. The manager immediately noticed this and turned back to her. "Ma'am, I'm going to call for immediate medical assistance," he said firmly. "Don't worry, everything's going to be fine." At that moment, Lisa felt a wave of regret wash over her. She had dismissed Margaret so quickly, ignored her pleas for help, and now this elderly woman was struggling. She realized she had been too focused on following the rules, on sticking to her policy, that she had forgotten the basic duty of care. The manager took out his phone and immediately contacted the flight crew in the cockpit. "We need medical assistance right now. I have a passenger here in need of help. Make sure we're prepared when we land," he said, speaking into the phone. Lisa stood there in shock, realizing how badly things had gone wrong. She could hear the murmurs of passengers who had seen everything, and some were even starting to speak up. The young woman from earlier, who had spoken out in defense of Margaret, whispered to the person sitting next to her. "She's lucky he's here. Otherwise, who knows what could have happened." Lisa's face turned even redder. The guilt began to settle deep inside her. She had failed in her duty. She had failed Margaret. And there was no hiding from that anymore. The manager turned back to Lisa and said in a steady voice, "I think we both know what needs to happen now." Lisa felt the weight of his words like a ton of bricks. She had always been proud of her job, but now, in this moment, she felt like the worst flight attendant on the plane. She had let her pride get in the way of doing what was right, and now Margaret was suffering because of it. "I'll take care of this," the manager said calmly. "You stay here and wait for the medical team to arrive." "And Lisa?" Lisa looked up at him, barely able to keep her eyes focused. "Yes. You'll be hearing from me after we land," he said. His tone was serious. "For now, just stay in your place and let's make sure this situation doesn't get worse." Lisa nodded, defeated. Lisa's heart pounded in her chest as she walked toward the front of the plane. She could feel the eyes of the passengers on her back, their gazes heavy and full of judgment. Some had even started whispering. A few muttered things like, "Is she getting fired right now, and she deserves it after what she did to that poor lady." Lisa had never felt so small in her life. All the confidence she once had felt like it was shattered. She had always been in control, always in charge. But now? Now, she was walking down the aisle, heading for the front of the plane, to face a fate she never imagined would come. The regional director led her to the small cabin near the cockpit. It was usually reserved for the pilot and co-pilot during flight. But today, this room was for Lisa. The director motioned for her to sit. "Sit down, Lisa," he said, his voice steady, but there was a firmness to it that made her stomach churn. She sat down slowly, not sure what to expect next. The sound of the engines was deafening, but her own heartbeat was louder. She wanted to explain herself, to tell him it wasn't that bad, but the words stuck in her throat. He stood across from her, his hands resting on the small table in front of him. "Lisa," he began, "I've been watching you. And I've seen how you've been treating our passengers. You've been rude. You've been dismissive. You've ignored people's needs. And for what? Just because you thought it was easier to follow policy than to show a little kindness." He shook his head. "This isn't what we stand for as a company." Lisa wanted to speak, wanted to defend herself, but she couldn't. She could feel the weight of his words sinking into her. Everything he said was true. She had been harsh. She had put rules before people. She had turned her back on someone who truly needed help. The regional director paused, looking at her with a hard, unforgiving stare. He seemed to be waiting for an answer. Lisa opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. She couldn't find a way to explain the unexplainable. How could she? "You know, Lisa," he said after a long pause, his tone changing. It was softer now, but still serious. "You have the power to make someone's day better. But instead, you chose to make it worse. You chose to hurt someone who didn't deserve it." Lisa's eyes filled with tears. She didn't want to cry. She didn't want to show weakness. But the truth of it all was too much for her to hide. She had been wrong. She had been so wrong. All she had wanted to do was keep things easy, follow the rules. But in doing so, she had lost sight of what really mattered. "You're a flight attendant, Lisa. You're here to help. And that means caring for people, every person who steps on this plane. Not just the ones you like. Not just the ones you think are easy to help," the regional director continued, his voice now quiet but full of authority. "When you signed up for this job, you signed up to put others before yourself. And I've seen that you've forgotten that." Lisa's throat tightened. She had always thought of herself as a professional. She had always prided herself on doing her job right. But now, looking back, she realized that her definition of doing things right had been wrong all along. "I'm going to have to let you go, Lisa," the regional director said, his words like a cold slap. "You're a good worker when you want to be. But you've lost sight of what really matters. I can't have someone like you representing this airline anymore." The words stung like nothing else. Lisa felt like her world was collapsing. She had spent years trying to climb the ladder, trying to prove herself. And now, it was all coming down in the span of just a few minutes. "Lisa, your things will be taken care of when we land. For now, you're done here," the regional director said, turning to leave. "I'll have someone else take your place." Lisa wanted to say something, anything. She wanted to scream. She wanted to fight for her job. But deep down, she knew the truth. She had brought this upon herself. Her mistakes had led to this moment. There was no one else to blame but her. As the director left, Lisa sat in silence. She felt the tears threatening to spill, but she held them back. This was her responsibility. She had made her choices, and now she had to face the consequences. Meanwhile, back in the cabin, the passengers were still in shock. No one had expected things to escalate this far. They had seen the whole thing unfold, from Margaret's weak request for water to Lisa's cold refusal, to the moment when the regional director had stepped in and taken charge. Some passengers exchanged glances, nodding in agreement with what had happened. A few whispered, "She deserved it." Others, however, felt a little more conflicted. They had seen Lisa's mistakes, but they couldn't help but feel a little sorry for her. After all, losing her job was a big consequence. But even so, no one spoke up for her. The manager's decision had been clear, and the passengers knew it was for the best. As the minutes passed, a new flight attendant entered the scene. She was young and fresh-faced, ready to step into the role that Lisa had left behind. She walked with confidence, greeting the passengers with a warm smile. The new attendant moved down the aisle, handing out drinks and snacks. She was polite and efficient, making sure everyone felt comfortable and cared for. Margaret, who had been so sick just moments ago, now felt a little more at ease. The new flight attendant noticed her immediately. "Are you feeling better, ma'am?" the new attendant asked kindly. Margaret nodded weakly, her eyes grateful for the attention she hadn't received earlier. "Yes, thank you," she whispered. "I'm feeling much better now." The flight went on, and the rest of the passengers settled into their seats. Some even nodded off as the hum of the engines filled the air. But no one forgot what had happened. By the time the plane landed, the atmosphere had changed. The air felt lighter, almost as if the tension had been lifted. Passengers began to gather their things and prepare to exit the plane. Margaret was one of the first to stand, slowly making her way toward the door. She was still a little shaky, but she was on her feet. As she reached the front of the plane, the new flight attendant noticed her and smiled. "I'm glad to see you feeling better, ma'am," the attendant said, her voice warm and sincere. Margaret smiled back, grateful for the kind words. "Thank you," she said softly. "I just wish more people were like you." "Like him," she added, nodding toward the regional director, who had stayed in the background, ensuring everything went smoothly. The regional director smiled back at her, a soft, approving look in his eyes. He nodded his head in acknowledgement, but didn't speak. He didn't need to. His actions had spoken louder than words ever could. Lisa, meanwhile, had quietly gathered her belongings. She was escorted off the plane and taken to a private area. Her career, her job, was over. She had learned a hard lesson, one that would stay with her for a long time. The hard truth was that kindness and respect mattered far more than following rules. People were more important than policies. And she had learned that lesson the hardest way possible. The seconds felt like hours for Lisa as the regional director led her through the narrow aisle. Every footstep she took felt heavier than the last, and with each passing second, she felt the weight of the situation bearing down on her. She glanced over her shoulder, but no one met her gaze. Passengers turned their heads, some whispering, some shaking their heads in disbelief. As they walked toward the front of the plane, her thoughts raced. She wanted to shout. She wanted to explain that she was just following the rules, that the policy said she couldn't give out water until the scheduled time. But she knew deep down that was only an excuse. The way she had treated Margaret was inexcusable. The way she had treated someone in need, someone who had been vulnerable and scared, was something that couldn't be brushed away with empty words. The regional director led her to the small space in the front where the pilots usually sat. It was a cramped area, not designed for personal conversations. But in that moment, it felt like a tiny cage. Her heart was pounding as he turned to face her. There was no hiding now. "Lisa," he said in a calm voice, but it was a voice that held authority, a voice that made her stomach drop. She didn't want to look at him, but she had no choice. She had to face him. He took a step forward, standing tall in front of her. The way he stood, his posture straight and unwavering, made Lisa feel even smaller. She had always thought of herself as confident and in control, but now she felt like a child being scolded by a teacher. The respect she had once demanded was gone. "You know why we were here," he continued. "I saw everything. You had a chance to help someone, to show compassion, and instead, you ignored her. You ignored the very person who needed help the most." Lisa opened her mouth to respond, but the words wouldn't come. She could feel the heat rising in her cheeks, the shame that she had tried so hard to ignore crashing over her like a wave. She had been wrong, and now, she had to face the consequences. He let out a heavy sigh, his expression unreadable. I've seen many flight attendants come and go, but what I saw today was unacceptable. You were rude, disrespectful, and worst of all, you were careless. You put your rules before a human being's safety. That's not what we do here. That's not the kind of behavior we tolerate. Lisa felt as though the walls were closing in around her. The regret that had been building up inside her all afternoon was now overwhelming her. She had been so caught up in herself, so caught up in making sure everything was right that she had lost sight of what truly mattered. Helping others. Showing kindness. I thought I was doing my job, she said softly, but even to her own ears, her voice sounded weak. There was no strength behind it. No conviction. You thought you were doing your job. The regional director's voice was quiet but filled with a cold edge. He leaned in, his eyes locking with hers. Your job is to serve people, to make sure they feel comfortable, respected, and cared for. When you refuse to help someone in need, you fail at your job. No matter how many rules you follow. It's that simple. Lisa's throat tightened. She couldn't argue with him. He was right, and she knew it. Today, you didn't do your job. And now, you're going to have to live with the consequences, he continued. As his words sank in, Lisa felt a strange calm wash over her. She had tried to tell herself that she could fix things, that there was some way to make it right. But now, in this tiny cabin, with the regional director's disappointed gaze burning into her, she realized that nothing she said could undo what she had done. The silence between them grew heavy, the only sound the hum of the airplane engines. Lisa's mind was racing, but she couldn't focus. She couldn't think of anything except the shame she felt. And the truth of it all was that there was no escaping it. She had made a mistake, and now she had to face it. The regional director took a step back, breaking the silence. Lisa, I don't take firing someone lightly. But this is a matter of principle. I can't allow someone like you to continue working here if you can't learn from this mistake. Lisa nodded, her throat too tight to speak. She had no defense. No excuses. She could only accept what was coming. As the regional director turned to leave, he paused and glanced back at her. His eyes softened for a brief moment, and he added, maybe you'll learn something from this. Maybe you'll change. But for now, this is the end. He stepped out of the small cabin, leaving Lisa alone with her thoughts. The door closed behind him with a soft click, but the sound felt like a final sentence. She was done. She was fired. And she would never be able to go back to the life she had known just a few hours ago. Back in the cabin, the passengers were still in shock. Some were talking in hushed tones, exchanging glances as they tried to process what had just happened. Others were silent, their expressions a mix of disbelief and confusion. They had just witnessed something that most people would never experience. A flight attendant, fired mid-flight. It was a strange feeling. A feeling that couldn't easily be explained. The new flight attendant who had been asked to step in moved down the aisle with ease, handing out drinks and snacks to the passengers. She was calm, polite, and attentive, responding to every request with a smile. The difference in her attitude compared to Lisa's was striking. She wasn't just doing her job, she was connecting with the passengers. She made everyone feel seen. She made everyone feel important. Margaret, the elderly woman who had been the cause of the earlier conflict, sat in her seat quietly, feeling the relief of no longer being ignored. The new flight attendant noticed her immediately and approached with a gentle smile. "Are you feeling better now, ma'am?" she asked, her voice full of warmth. Margaret smiled back, her face tired but grateful. "Yes, thank you. I'm much better now. It's been a long flight, but I feel safe with you here." The new flight attendant nodded. "I'm glad to hear that. Please don't hesitate to ask if you need anything else." The kindness in the attendant's voice was like a breath of fresh air to Margaret. She hadn't felt this cared for since the beginning of the flight. The new attendant wasn't just fulfilling her duties, she was making a difference. Margaret's heart felt a little lighter. As the plane descended toward the airport, passengers began to gather their belongings, preparing to disembark. The tension in the cabin had lessened. The events that had unfolded were still fresh in everyone's minds, but the mood was no longer as heavy. The situation had been resolved, and the passengers could now leave the plane knowing that justice had been done. When the plane landed, Lisa wasn't there to bid the passengers farewell. She wasn't there to help them gather their things or to make sure they were safe as they exited the aircraft. The flight attendant who had taken over Lisa's duties did all of that with grace and care. Lisa, on the other hand, was left behind in the small cabin at the front of the plane, her future uncertain. She wasn't sure what she would do next. She had no job. She had no income. And worst of all, she felt like she had lost everything that mattered. Her pride. Her reputation. Her sense of purpose. But as she walked off the plane and into the terminal, she realized something important. This wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. A beginning of learning, growing, and changing. Lisa knew she had to make things right. She had to learn to be better, to care more, and to treat people with the respect they deserved. It wasn't going to be easy. It wasn't going to happen overnight. But Lisa was determined to change. She had learned the hardest way possible that compassion and empathy mattered more than anything else. Margaret's heart lightened when she was finally given the water she had asked for. The new flight attendant, who had quickly stepped in to take over, had a gentle smile as she handed it to her. "Here you go, ma'am. Please drink slowly. If you need anything else, just let me know," she said, her voice calm and reassuring. Margaret took the water gratefully, her hands still shaking from the earlier incident. The elderly woman had been uncomfortable and nervous, but now, after the kindness from the new flight attendant, she felt a little bit more at ease. Her throat was dry, and the dizziness that had plagued her for what felt like hours seemed to fade slowly with each sip. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the cool water calm her body, and finally, she could breathe a little easier. As Margaret rested in her seat, she overheard quiet conversations between some of the other passengers. They were whispering, but it wasn't hard to catch the words. Some were still in shock, and others were murmuring their opinions about what had happened. "I can't believe she treated that poor woman like that," one passenger said, shaking their head. "I hope she gets what she deserves." "I saw everything," another passenger added, voice soft but firm. "She just turned her back on a woman who needed help. I would have said something, but I'm glad the director stepped in." Some passengers nodded, agreeing with the sentiment. Others were still too stunned to speak, but all shared the same understanding: what had happened wasn't right. They couldn't help but feel the weight of the situation. The person who was supposed to care for them had shown the complete opposite, and that couldn't go unnoticed. Lisa, meanwhile, was now seated in the very back of the plane, far away from the passengers who had been watching her. She was no longer wearing her uniform. The blue jacket that had once been a symbol of authority and professionalism was gone. Instead, she sat in an uncomfortable silence, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She had never felt so small. Her cheeks burned with humiliation, and her stomach twisted in knots. Her mind raced, but she didn't have any words to explain herself. What could she possibly say now? For years, she had worked hard in this career, proud of her job and her position as a flight attendant. But she had forgotten the most important part of her job: the people. She had let her desire to follow the rules blind her to the human beings sitting around her. Margaret had needed her help, but instead of offering kindness, she had turned away. And now, Lisa was paying the price for it. Lisa stared out of the window, watching as the clouds drifted by below. She felt as if she were floating in a world where she didn't belong anymore. It wasn't just the uniform that had been taken from her. It was her dignity. The respect she once commanded had crumbled, and the realization hit her hard. She had failed in the most basic way possible. She had failed someone who trusted her. The flight continued toward its destination, but the atmosphere was completely different now. The passengers who had been worried and uncertain earlier now felt a sense of relief. They had witnessed something rare, something that didn't happen every day. They had seen justice in action. The right thing had been done, and the person who had wronged another was no longer in a position of power. There was a quiet satisfaction in the air, as if everyone on the plane knew that the situation had been handled correctly. Margaret, after finishing her water, felt a little stronger. She was tired, yes, but she was no longer worried. The flight attendant who had taken over had treated her with the kindness she had longed for. The woman had checked on her, asked if she was comfortable, and made sure she felt safe. There was no rush, no coldness. It was exactly what Margaret had needed. As the plane began its descent into the airport, Margaret felt herself relax. The flight had been long and difficult, but now, it was almost over. And for the first time since she had boarded the flight, she felt like a human being again, not just a passenger, but someone who mattered. When the plane touched down at the airport, the passengers began to gather their things. Some of them were still talking softly among themselves, while others were busy checking the time or getting ready to leave. The whole experience had been strange, unsettling even, but now that the flight had ended, there was a sense of closure. The new flight attendant, who had stepped in for Lisa, moved up and down the aisles, helping people with their carry-on bags and offering last-minute assistance. Her friendly demeanor had won over the passengers, and they felt comfortable with her. She didn't just do her job, she took the time to make sure everyone was okay. It wasn't just the water that had made a difference for Margaret, it was the kindness that came with it. The passengers noticed it too. Lisa remained seated at the back of the plane, still staring out the window. She knew she couldn't hide from the consequences anymore. She had been caught, and there was no going back. The flight was over, and it was time to face reality. As the passengers began to leave, many gave Lisa an uncertain glance. Some didn't make eye contact at all, while others seemed to shake their heads. It wasn't about anger anymore, it was about disappointment. They had seen someone who was supposed to take care of them fail to do so. And in that moment, they knew they were right to feel the way they did. They had witnessed justice served. When Lisa finally stepped off the plane, she was greeted by the airline's manager. The same regional director who had intervened earlier was now waiting near the gate. His stern expression made it clear that there would be no easy way out. Lisa had hoped, even for a moment, that there might be some chance for redemption, but deep down, she knew it was over. "You can go now," the regional director said. "You're no longer needed here. We've already called your supervisor. Your job is officially terminated." Lisa nodded, her face pale. There was nothing more to say. She had lost her position, and she had lost her chance at a second chance. The people she had wronged might never forget what she had done. And maybe, just maybe, they would remember the flight attendant who didn't care when someone was in need. The weight of the loss was heavy on Lisa's heart as she left the terminal. It wasn't just the end of her career, it was the end of an era. She had to find a new path, and she would have to rebuild everything from the ground up. She would have to find a way to redeem herself, to prove that she could be the person she had failed to be that day. But for now, there was nothing she could do except walk away. As Margaret left the plane, she was grateful. She didn't care about what had happened to Lisa. She wasn't angry at her, she was just happy to be treated with respect. For Margaret, that was enough. Sometimes, it wasn't about getting revenge or about watching someone else fall. Sometimes, it was simply about being treated the way everyone deserved to be treated. She felt a wave of relief wash over her as she exited the airport. Her journey had been long, but she had learned something that day, something important. People needed kindness. They needed empathy. And sometimes, when you're in the most vulnerable position, all you need is someone who will care enough to help. For Lisa, her future was uncertain. But for Margaret, the day had ended on a hopeful note. She knew that the world was still full of good people, people who would treat her with kindness. She could go on with her life, knowing that sometimes, justice is served in the simplest of ways, with a glass of water, with a smile, and with the compassion that all human beings deserve. As the airplane doors closed and the plane began to taxi to its gate, it was clear that while one chapter had ended for Lisa, another had begun for Margaret, a chapter filled with respect, dignity, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing that justice had been done. As the airplane slowly made its way toward the terminal, everyone who had witnessed what happened seemed to feel the weight of the moment. Some passengers were still whispering to each other, reflecting on the situation. Others were quiet, lost in their thoughts. And then, there were those who had seen everything unfold with clear eyes. They understood something important, something that would stick with them long after the plane had landed. It's easy to underestimate people. Maybe it's because we are busy, or maybe it's because we judge others by their appearances. It happens all the time. We see someone who is older, or quieter, or different in some way, and without thinking, we assume they don't matter as much. We dismiss them as unimportant. But what if that person is important? What if they've been through more than we could ever imagine? What if they have power in ways we can't see at first? That's exactly what happened on this flight. Lisa, the flight attendant, saw Margaret as just another elderly woman, someone who was weak and needed to follow the rules. She didn't see Margaret for who she really was, an individual with her own strength, her own history, and her own dignity. Lisa had made a big mistake. She had assumed that because Margaret was older and frail, she wasn't worth caring about. But the truth? Margaret had more power than Lisa realized. Not because of anything she did, but because of the respect she deserved as a person. When we treat others with kindness, we give them a voice, a choice, and the opportunity to stand tall even when they are in a position of weakness. What Lisa didn't know, and what Margaret proved in that moment, was that sometimes people don't need to be loud or strong to make an impact. Sometimes, they just need to be seen for who they are. And when they aren't seen, something can happen, something bigger than we expect. In this case, it was instant karma. As soon as Lisa chose to treat Margaret with disrespect, someone who was watching noticed. A person who could make a difference. A person who had the power to make sure that what happened wasn't forgotten. And when that person took action, everything changed. In a flash, Lisa was removed from the situation, and the power shifted to someone who had learned the importance of empathy, respect, and kindness. Karma is real, whether we want to believe it or not. And sometimes, it works faster than we think. When we choose to hurt others, even in small ways, it's like planting a seed that can grow into something unexpected. But when we choose kindness, respect, and understanding, we also plant seeds that can grow and spread to others. Margaret didn't fight back. She didn't ask for revenge. She just wanted what she deserved, a little water and a little dignity. And because of that, her quiet strength became the lesson of the day. So, what's the message we take away from this story? The truth is, it's a reminder that how we treat others matters. It doesn't matter if someone is older or younger, louder or quieter, richer or poorer. Every single person deserves kindness. Every single person deserves respect. And when we forget that, we might find ourselves facing consequences we didn't see coming. Just like Lisa did. But here's the good news: it's never too late to change. Just because Lisa lost her job that day doesn't mean she couldn't learn from her mistake. It doesn't mean that she couldn't grow into someone better. Maybe she needed this hard lesson to realize that her actions have consequences, and that being kind is more important than following the rules at all costs. The story isn't about her failure, it's about how we can all learn from our mistakes and do better next time. What about you, though? What do you think? Was Lisa's firing justified? Did she deserve what happened to her? Or should the airline have handled it differently? Let me know what you think in the comments. I would love to hear your thoughts. After all, we all have a part to play in making the world a better place, one small act of kindness at a time. And while you're at it, if you love stories like this one, be sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. That way, you won't miss out on more stories that remind us of the importance of respect, justice, and the unexpected ways life can surprise us. Before we finish, let's think about something else for a moment. How often do we take the time to consider what's really going on in someone else's life? How often do we look past the surface and try to understand them? If we could do that a little more often, imagine how much better the world could be. Imagine if we gave just a little more kindness, even when we think someone might not need it. Think about it. A simple smile or a few kind words could change someone's entire day. What if that person is just waiting for someone to notice them? What if your kindness is exactly what they need in that moment? You never know. The person you might underestimate could be the one who teaches you a life-changing lesson. So, let's not wait for something bad to happen to remind us to treat others well. Let's choose kindness every day, in every situation. Whether you're at school, at work, or even just walking down the street, remember that everyone has a story. No one should be treated like they don't matter, just like Margaret wasn't. The next time you see someone in need, remember the lesson from this story. You have the power to make someone's life better with a small act of kindness. And that's the kind of power we should all strive for. So, go ahead. Make the world a better place, one kind action at a time. You just might be surprised at what happens when you do. Thank you so much for joining us in this story. I hope it gave you something to think about and reminded you that everyone deserves kindness. I can't wait to hear your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to hit like if you enjoyed this, and subscribe for more stories that will inspire and motivate you. Remember, sometimes justice doesn't come in the way we expect. Sometimes, it's a quiet moment of realization that changes everything. And if you treat others with the respect they deserve, you can be part of that change. The world needs more people like you.